Hello, I'm the Greasy Gaming, number one source for number 2 games. It's not been long since I reviewed Time Crisis on the PlayStation, and I simply had a craving for more Crisis. So today I'm going to be covering all the TC games in my collection. If you didn't see my review of the original game, I'd recommend you watch that one first, as this one may seem less informative. Now don't worry, I will go over the core mechanics of the game, so don't think I'll only talk about the new stuff here. The Crisis series originated in 1994 but was ported to console a year later. Only 2 TC games made it to the PlayStation 1 before 2 direct sequels were made on the later consoles, starting in 2001. Let's start off by playing Time Crisis Project Titan, the sort of sequel to the original game and its expansion. If you've never played Time Crisis before, allow me to explain the gameplay. The whole objective is to get to the end of the level without running out of time. In order to move throughout the level, you need to kill all enemies on screen without taking too many hits yourself. The only control your character has is with the aim of the gun and taking cover, both of which you need to be exceptional with in later games. Unlike other shooters, you can't just run out and blow your foes to smithereens, because only the game decides when you move forward or change position. The time limit usually starts with a minute or 45 seconds, and while this doesn't sound like much, you can get more time by scoring headshots, shooting hidden enemies, interacting with the environment, and generally moving on. In Project Titan, the gameplay isn't expanded upon much, nor did it bring anything new. One of the things that ticked me off is the sound and the fact that on several versions of the game, you don't get any background music regardless of the settings. In the Platinum Label version, this should have been fixed, but apparently in some cases it wasn't. Each of the games has a story which is pretty generic, but at least it gives you a reason as to why the gameplay is so linear, not to mention it gives your enemies and your character purpose. The antagonist has always got something to do with the terrorist Wild Dog, who you can see in later games far more often than the first. You play as Richard Miller, who has to rescue an informant not long after the events of the previous game, but in the process is being framed for the assassination of Karuba's president, a new location in the Time Crisis universe. He only has 48 hours to rescue the informant and clear his name before the officials come to take him down. The graphics are heavily outdated, and it went to show that there's not much the PS1 could have done nearing the end of its lifespan. The game apparently took 2 years to develop but received negative reception due to how crippled the visuals and animations were. I have to admit though, the game's graphics only made the experience better for me. There's not really much to say about Project Titan apart from it being an okay expansion. It didn't really add much to the lore, but it's good to know that Richard Miller saw some more attention and is one of the most kick-ass mute protagonists I know. That's pretty much Project Titan out of the way, but before we move on to the next game, I think it's time we talked about the G-Con. The G-Con is one of my best friends, mostly due to its accuracy, responsiveness, and novelty. This was the controller I had used for the original Time Crisis review, but for Project Titan I went with the pad. One of the best things about this gun is that it's compatible with the PlayStation 2, so for those who couldn't get the G-Con 2, they can always crack this one out and play Time Crisis. But for the sake of review, I bought another gun just to play Time Crisis 2. Now this came bundled with Time Crisis 3 and was apparently limited edition, meaning that if you were unlucky you'd have to get both the gun and the game box separately. This only cost me 22 quid from eBay, which in my opinion isn't bad for a controller in such quality. The G-Con has additional buttons as well as a D-pad on the back for further navigation, and even a clip which you press under the grip. While all these innovations are great, I still prefer the original because it fit in my hand nicely and in my opinion looks far better. This gun is rather responsive, working far better on my TV than the 45, but my biggest and possibly only complaint would have to be that the trigger is too stiff. Now maybe that's because of the condition or the gauge. I mean the condition's perfectly fine, but either way I don't like it. Now anyway, let's talk about Time Crisis 2. Time Crisis 2 saw its release in October 2001 and was the very first TC game to have co-op multiplayer, one of the things I've always wanted to see in the franchise. It was also the last game to be released for Namco's final arcade machine, the System 23, in 1997. Amazing what they can do with ports to the PS2, eh? Apparently, if you complete the game enough times you have access to bonus weapons, and the game will even allow you to dual-wield 2 G-Cons. But as far as I'm aware, this isn't true and is only a rumour circulated around Time Crisis' emphasis on replayability. My favourite thing about Time Crisis 2 is the alternative routes that one can take, and each time you play the game you automatically swap with your partner to take one of two routes. When another player isn't with you, the AI does a cracking job of gunning down foes whilst you help out from another angle. A common problem with the previous games was not being able to see which bullets were certain hits and which weren't. You could argue that it was simply random, but it was in fact scripted. Later versions of the games tried to colour the bullets in so that'd be easier to see the direct hit ones, but it wasn't enough. So in Time Crisis 2, the bullets look like huge red pellets or globules heading straight for you. It may look as though the game's been dumbed down way too much, but it's still very easy to get hit by these particular shots. The only problem I have is that it removes the sense of danger from other gunners. The environment also plays a big part in the game, far more so than in previous titles. In this game it's very important to take cover when something in the environment heads your way, because if you don't, you take a hit. 3 hits and it's game over. The thing I remember most about Time Crisis 2 was the boat chase in the second chapter, which adds so much more depth and excitement to the game. I was thoroughly impressed by the animations, the fluency of the control, and the different types of tactics you use once in this one fight. There's many more fights like this later on, but I remember this one single fight from the start. Definitely one of the most iconic moments in the entire series. The graphics in TC2 are far more refined than the previous game, as the environments and character models are much more detailed and the animations are simply stunning for a game this old. And the soundtrack? Well, it's just average. Time Crisis 3 was released by Nex Entertainment, the second TC game that wasn't by Namco but still published by them. TC3 was also published 2 years after the previous game, adding more emphasis on different guns. It was also the first Crisis game to go to mobile phones, but obviously not as advanced as its console counterpart. Apart from multiple weapons and the sniper mode in this game, there's very little to talk about. The gameplay is still okay, there's hardly anything wrong with it, but after playing these games several times in a row without breaks, it does wear off on you. I've also noticed that the visuals and soundtrack have had an improvement. My guess is because of a different graphics engine thanks to different developers, but the textures here look muddier and less vibrant than Time Crisis 2. Next up is Crisis Zone, or it would be if it worked. Should this game actually run, it plays for a minute or two then freezes. A shame, because I had a lot to say about it before it fucked out completely. Well, that's all the Time Crisis games in my collection covered, so I guess until the next time, I'm the Greasy Gamer, your number one source for number 2 games, and I'll... Greasgorrok, I'm getting kind of pissed with you. You never finish your reviews, just like you never did with Alien vs Predator. So here, this is Time Crisis. Review it! Wow, thanks UT! I guess it's time to have a quick look at Time Crisis 4 then. Time Crisis 4 originally came bundled with the gun, but after seeing some reviews about it requiring sensors like the Nintendo Power Glove and its irresponsiveness, I decided to pass. A shame really, as it's one of the few guns that would work fully on my TV. Probably. Time Crisis 4 was still in the hands of Nex Entertainment, but after being published by Sony Computer Entertainment Europe, it was released in 2008. The game was re-released in Raising Storm in October 2010. Unfortunately, I shan't be reviewing that one today, because from what I recall, it's just a remake of the older games. I have to say, after the semi-average Time Crisis 3, I'm impressed. The gunplay is really satisfying here and still has the arcade feel. While obviously it doesn't hold as much novelty as the earliest games of the series, it still remains loyal to the concept. Once again, Nex brings us more weapons, more bad guys, and of course more characters, but I think these two protagonists are a bit... 70s for my liking. I don't know, but the guy in the pink coat has a rocking stash. The most notable new feature would be FPS mode, and while all the TC games are in first person, this one takes on the more modern shooter concept. In this mode you have to navigate the map yourself, monitor a health bar rather than lives, and follow a series of objectives by yourself. If there's one thing I don't like about the Crisis games, it's the lifespan, but this mode adds a few more hours life. Also, it's a good way to get into FPS games, but might be considered a bit too easy for hardened shooter fans. As per usual, outside of the guns and enemies, Time Crisis 4 adds very little to what it's all about, taking cover and shooting, but I don't see what it is about this one that's the best besides the first and second game. Concluding with this one, I have to say that the visuals and audio are once again fantastic. So that's it, I'm afraid, which is a shame because I just can't get enough Time Crisis. So until the next time, I'm the Greasy Gamer, your number one source for number 2 games. If you'd excuse me, I've got to try and dual weld some G-Cons. Ta-ta for now!